Section 1. The world before the fire. There is a version of this world where none of it ever happens, where two boys grow up as the best of friends, where a comet passes overhead and people stop in the streets to look up in wonder, where the air temples still ring with the sound of children playing, where the southern seas are full of fishing boats and the earth kingdom stretches peaceful and enormous from coast to coast, unmolested, unbroken, where 100 years of ordinary life unfold quietly in a world that stays in balance because the people charged with keeping it upright chose to do exactly that. That version of the world did not happen. What happened instead is one of the most devastating conflicts in the history of any fictional universe ever created. A war that killed an entire nation. A war that lasted so long that children were born into it who grew old and died inside it before it ended. A war that rearranged the geography, the politics, the culture, and the very soul of an entire world, and left behind wounds so deep they were still open 100 years later, still bleeding in the hands of the people we follow across 61 episodes. But before we can understand what the 100-Year War was, we need to understand what it ended. We need to go back to before Zero AG. Back to when the world still worked. Picture the world of Avatar as it existed somewhere around 50 years before the war. The four nations had been distinct but largely at peace for generations. Not a perfect peace, not the absence of all friction, but the kind of durable, functional coexistence that happens when different peoples have lived alongside each other for long enough that the edges have worn smooth. The air nomads traveled between their four temples, eastern, western, northern, and southern, on the backs of sky bison, trading and meditating, and staying largely out of everyone's affairs with the gentle detachment of people who had genuinely internalized the idea that permanence is an illusion worth releasing. They were vegetarians. They were wanderers. Their whole culture was built around the idea of not holding too tightly to anything, including the ground. Airbending itself, that fluid, circular, endlessly evasive martial art, reflected an entire philosophy. Do not oppose, redirect. Do not plant your feet, move with. The air nomads were monks, essentially. A traveling monastic order spread across four mountain peaks and the endless sky between them. The water tribes at the poles were different in almost every way. The northern tribe had built something extraordinary at the top of the world. A city carved entirely from ice, with canals and bridges and buildings that caught the pale Arctic light and turned it into something that looked almost warm. Their society was organized and traditional, with waterbending preserved and taught and taken seriously as both a martial art and a means of survival. The southern tribe was smaller, less formally organized, but no less alive. A community of hunters and fishers and warriors scattered across the ice flats of the Southern Ocean, matrilineal in some of their traditions, deeply connected to the rhythms of the sea and the sky. Between north and south there was kinship, shared language and tradition, and a cultural thread that ran beneath everything like the cold, deep current under ice. The Earth Kingdom was enormous. There is no other word for it. It covered the largest continuous landmass in the known world, and contained within it dozens of distinct cultures, dialects, climates, and landscapes. From the forests in the west to the deserts of the interior to the great walled city of Ba Sing Se in the east, the Earth Kingdom was not really one thing, but many things loosely organized under the idea of a single authority. Local lords and provincial kings and governors ran their own territories with considerable independence. The Earth King in Ba Sing Se had real power, but exercised it at a remove from most of his people's daily lives. This political looseness, which would become a catastrophic weakness during the war, was in times of peace simply the natural shape of a nation too large to hold tightly together. And the Fire Nation. Even before the war, the Fire Nation was not a quiet place. It had always been an ambitious nation. Its people were firebenders in a more than literal sense, drawn to intensity and heat and movement, to the kind of society that builds things quickly and burns what it has finished with. By the time of Fire Lord Sozin's rise, the Fire Nation had already developed technologies that the other nations had not yet reached. Metal-hulled ships, organized military academies, a centralized chain of command that could move large forces efficiently across great distances. None of this was inherently threatening. Technological development is not aggression, but it created the conditions for aggression in ways that the Fire Nation's leadership would prove willing to exploit. Fire Lord Sozin had not always been who he would become. The story of the 100-Year War does not begin with a villain. It begins with something more complicated and therefore more frightening, a friendship. Two boys, one the crown prince of the Fire Nation and the other the Avatar, growing up together in the Fire Nation capital, sharing meals and lessons and the particular closeness of childhood friends who sense that the world is big and that they are small and that it is better to face that bigness together. Sozin and Roku were close in the way that only happens at a certain age, the kind of close where you can say anything and the other person already knows the answer before you finish the sentence. They trained together. They laughed together. When Roku was identified as the new Avatar and was called away to begin his training, both of them wept. That was real. That grief was real. The friendship was real. What Sozin grew into after Roku left was also real. A slow burn of ideology, the kind that starts as a reasonable idea and builds over decades into something unrecognizable. Sozin's belief, the thing that he told himself and eventually told Roku directly, was that the Fire Nation had something the rest of the world needed: prosperity, advancement, organization. And he genuinely believed, or convinced himself that he believed, that sharing these things with the world was not conquest, it was generosity. He was wrong. But he did not start out knowing he was wrong. When Roku returned to the Fire Nation after completing his Avatar training, the two men were reunited, and for a time, everything seemed as though it might hold together. Roku married a woman named Ta Min. Sozin came to the wedding as his oldest friend. They watched the comet pass together, that great burning tail of light across the sky, and they were young men, and the world was full of possibility, and in that one moment, it might have been possible to believe that this was how it would always be. It would not always be that way. Something was already shifting in Sozin, something quiet and patient and terrible. It would not declare itself for many more years. But it was there, in the gaps between conversations, in the way his eyes moved when he looked at maps, in the long silences when Roku talked about balance. And so the world before the war ends here, with two old friends on a clifftop watching something bright cross the sky, neither of them yet knowing that the brightness they are watching will one day be the thing that ends everything they once were to each other. The world before the fire was real. It existed. It had weight and texture and ordinary human beauty. And understanding that it existed, that it was lost, that it was not reclaimed but replaced with something worse for a century, is the only way to understand what the 100-Year War actually cost. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely want to know where in the world you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it's free and it helps more than you'd think. Section 2. Sozin's fracture, the slow breaking of a friendship. The thing about Sozin's ideology is that it required a villain's conviction wrapped in a diplomat's language. When he first proposed to Roku that the Fire Nation's prosperity should be spread across the world, he did not say it with fire in his eyes. He said it the way you say something that you have already decided is true, with the calm certainty of someone who has lived with an idea long enough that it no longer feels like a choice. He genuinely framed it as generosity, as a gift, as the natural next step for a civilization that had built so much and had, he argued, so much to offer. Roku saw it for what it was. This is one of the things that makes Avatar: The Last Airbender so precise in its construction. The way it shows you that the people responsible for the most catastrophic events in its world were not mindless monsters, but thinking, feeling people who made choices. Choices that were wrong. Choices that had consequences that outlasted their own lives by generations. Sozin was not stupid. He was not cruel in the way that some Fire Lords after him would be cruel. He was something almost more dangerous, a true believer. A man who had convinced himself that what he wanted and what was right for the world were the same thing, and who had enough power and enough conviction and enough time to act on that belief before anyone could stop him. Roku rejected him, clearly, directly, without ambiguity. He told Sozin that the world did not need the Fire Nation's gift, that every nation was its own and had its own right to exist on its own terms, and that what Sozin was describing was not generosity but control with better packaging. The confrontation ended the age of their friendship. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic rupture, but the damage was done. Two men who had once finished each other's sentences were now on opposite sides of a fundamental disagreement about what the world was for. What Sozin did next is the kind of thing that people who believe they are right always do. He waited. He did not abandon his plan. He did not come back to Roku with a changed heart. He simply continued building, quietly, in the spaces that the Avatar's watchful eye did not reach, laying foundations for something that had not yet announced itself. And years passed. Sozin grew older. Roku grew older. The world continued turning. Then came the day that should have ended it. Roku discovered Fire Nation colonies that had been secretly established in the Earth Kingdom, the first concrete act of the expansion that Sozin had only spoken about before. And Roku flew to confront him. Not in diplomacy, not in a letter, in person, on the back of his dragon fang, landing in the middle of the Fire Nation capital and making his objection impossible to ignore. What happened next was one of the briefest and most significant battles in Avatar history. Two old friends who had trained together and grown up together and loved each other across decades now facing each other with everything they had, and Roku winning and choosing to spare Sozin's life because he was still the person he had once been to him. Still, underneath everything, his oldest friend. It was an act of mercy. It was also functionally a postponement, because Sozin did not change. He only waited again. He waited for something he could not make happen himself. Something that would give him an edge so overwhelming that even the Avatar could not stop him in time. He waited for the comet. In the years that followed, Roku settled back on his home island, the island he had been born on and had returned to after his travels, a volcanic island in the remote southern Fire Nation territories. And Sozin watched. And the comet got closer. 12 years before 0 AG, everything moved at once. Roku's island went into violent eruption. Sozin, who was close enough to see the volcanic cloud on the horizon from 100 miles away, flew to help his old friend. The two of them fought the volcanic forces together, bending and redirecting and struggling against something larger than either of them alone. And for a moment it must have seemed like the old days, like two boys facing the world side by side. They were winning. They were holding it back. And then Sozin stopped. He looked at Roku, surrounded by toxic volcanic gas, exhausted and overwhelmed, and he made a calculation. A cold, patient, deliberate calculation. And he flew away. He left Roku to die. Avatar Roku perished on his home island, killed not by the volcano but by the man who had been his closest friend and who recognized in that moment that the obstacle standing between him and his ambition was kneeling in front of him, helpless. There is a brutality to that moment that is almost too quiet to look at directly. Sozin did not strike Roku down in battle. He just stopped helping. He just let what was already happening continue to happen. The most passive act of betrayal imaginable, and one of the most effective. When Roku's eyes closed for the last time and the Dragon Fang chose to stay and die beside him rather than fly to safety, the last check on Sozin's ambition dissolved with the volcanic smoke. 12 years. That is how long it took for Sozin to move after that. 12 years of preparation, of building up the Fire Nation's military capacity to a pitch that the world had never seen, of constructing the ideological framework that would make his soldiers believe they were fighting for something righteous, of planning the logistics of an attack so overwhelming and so simultaneous that nothing, no one, no avatar could respond in time. He was waiting for the comet. The same comet that had passed over the world when he and Roku were young men, the same comet they had watched together from that clifftop, was due to return. And Sozin had understood something about it that he kept to himself like a stone in his chest for decades. When the comet came close to the world, the firebending ability of every Fire Nation soldier would be amplified to a degree that made them, for a window of time, almost unstoppable. He had been building toward that window for his entire adult life. Now let us talk about what he knew about the Avatar cycle, because this is crucial to understanding why he did what he did first, before he moved against the Earth Kingdom or the Water Tribes. Sozin knew that Roku had died. He knew that the Avatar cycle would continue, that a new Avatar would be born somewhere in the world, and he knew which nation was next in the rotation. The cycle goes fire, air, water, earth, and it repeats. Roku was fire. The next Avatar would be born as an air nomad. A child, probably a young child, somewhere in one of the 4 air temples scattered across the world. Sozin's plan was simple in its logic and monstrous in its execution. If he could kill the new Avatar before the Avatar had time to grow into their power, he would remove the one force in the world capable of stopping him. And to kill the Avatar with certainty, given that he could not know which specific air nomad child it was, he would have to kill them all. Every single one. Section 3. 0 AG, the night that ended a world. The air nomads did not know what was coming. Let me hold that for a moment. Let it settle into the silence. The air nomads, tens of thousands of people spread across 4 mountain temples that the Fire Nation military had never managed to reach before. People who had lived peacefully and apart from world politics for generations, who had no standing army, who carried weapons only in the loosest philosophical sense, who were defined by a culture so thoroughly built around non-attachment and flowing movement that the idea of digging in and fighting a war was almost conceptually alien to them. They did not know. There were warnings. Avatar Roku's spirit appeared to the Air Nomad Council of Elders in the years before the comet, according to what the expanded lore preserves. The knowledge was there, in fragments, that something was coming, that the Fire Nation was moving towards something no one had quite named yet. But the full shape of it, the true scale of what Sozin was planning, that was beyond imagining, because it required imagining a kind of evil that very few people are capable of imagining until they are standing inside it. The Council of Elders at the Southern Air Temple did identify the new avatar earlier than they normally would have. Tradition held that an avatar was not informed of their identity until they turned 16. But the elders sensed the threat gathering in the world, and they told a 12-year-old boy named Aang that he was the avatar when he was young enough that the news landed on him not as a gift but as a weight, as a thing being taken away, his childhood, his normalcy, his ability to just be a boy. His best friend among the monks, a man named Gyatso who loved him the way a father loves a son, knew what informing Aang so early really meant. It meant the elders were afraid. It meant they planned to send him away, to protect him, to separate him from the people he loved in order to preserve what they believed the world needed. They were right to be afraid. They were too late. The comet arrived in the year that would become 0 AG, the 0 point from which all of Avatar's history is measured forward and backward, the moment that split the world into before and after. Sozin's military moved in the darkness before dawn. The assault on the air temples was not a battle in any conventional sense. The comet's presence in the sky amplified every firebender in Sozin's army to a degree that made them something beyond what they normally were. The Fire Nation had engineered its soldiers to carry the comet's enhancement into combat with maximum effect. Concentrated force delivered simultaneously to 4 locations spread across the world, each one home to some of the most naturally gifted benders alive, and the answer to that was not superior bending. It was overwhelming numbers and overwhelming firepower, and the advantage of a target that had no walls and no army and no warning that came soon enough to matter. The air temples fell. Each one, all 4, in the same terrible span of hours, on the same night, under the same comet-lit sky. The Fire Nation soldiers who carried out these attacks were not all monsters in the private sense. Some of them, perhaps many of them, had been told the same story Sozin had been telling himself, that they were bringing the Fire Nation's greatness to a world that needed it, that the air nomads had somehow been a threat, that this was necessary. History is full of ordinary people who did extraordinary evil because the story they were given made it feel like something else. The soldiers at the air temples were following orders. That does not excuse what they did, but it explains in its cold way how it could happen without every participant being a conscious murderer. What happened to the air temples is described only in fragments across the show. We see the southern air temple when Aang returns to it in Book 1, and what we see is the silence of a place that was once full of people and is now full of the absence of them. Gyatso's skeleton surrounded by Fire Nation armor, the evidence of a last stand so fierce that the old monk took down dozens of soldiers before he fell. Statues of past avatars with their faces unmoved while the world burned around them. The training grounds empty. The sky, which had always been full of bison and children, utterly clear. A small number of air nomads survived the initial attack. Some were away from the temples when the assault came. Some fled before the fire reached them. Some managed to fight their way out, using the inherent advantage of airbending, its speed and its evasiveness, to slip through what should have been an airtight net. But Sozin had planned for this too. He ordered the relics removed from the temples and used to furnish decoy residences in the mountains of the Earth Kingdom, places made to look like air nomad safe houses, real enough to fool desperate people looking for somewhere to hide. His spies then spread rumors through Earth Kingdom populations about where these safe houses were, and the surviving air nomads, starving and frightened and seeking their own kind, walked into them. Every air nomad they could find, hunted down and killed. This is the part that does not appear in the show because the show is not able to show it. but it is there in the logic of what the show gives us. Sozin did not stop with the temples. He finished the work, except he could not finish it entirely, because the one he was looking for, the child he was burning a people into ash to reach, was not at the southern air temple when his soldiers arrived. Aang had run away, not from the attack, which he could not have predicted any more than anyone else. He had run from the Elder's decision to send him away for training, from the weight of the Avatar's title, from the loss of Gyatso and the normal life, and the childhood that was being carefully and lovingly dismantled around him by people who loved him and thought they were protecting him. He ran the way children run when everything is too much, instinctively, with no destination. He flew out over the southern ocean on the back of his sky bison Appa, and a storm caught them, and the ice closed over them, and 100 years passed. He would not learn what happened to his people for almost a year after he woke up. When Sokka and Katara pulled him out of that iceberg in the pilot episode of the show, they were not just rescuing a boy. They were waking up the last witness to a crime that had been buried under a century of Fire Nation propaganda and deliberate forgetting. Sozin spent the remaining years of his life searching for the Avatar he had failed to kill. He never found him. He died at the age of 102, having lived long enough to see the war he started become something permanent and self-sustaining, a machine that no longer needed him to keep running. He died, as the show tells us in one of its most devastating asides, with deep regret over what he had done. Too late. Always too late. The comet that bore his name returned to the sky every 100 years, and the next time it came back, it would be over a world reshaped entirely by the night it first arrived. Section 4. The war spreads Sozin's long afternoon. With the air nomads effectively gone, Sozin turned the full weight of the Fire Nation's military capacity toward the remaining two nations. This transition from the air nomad genocide to the broader war is something the show gestures at rather than depicts in detail, and that is appropriate, because the broad war against the Earth Kingdom and Water Tribes is not a single dramatic event, but a long grinding process, the kind of conflict that wears at the shape of the world through slow, continuous pressure rather than sudden catastrophic impact. The air nomad genocide was a night. The war against the Earth Kingdom was a century. The Earth Kingdom was the primary theater of the war, because it was the largest and most strategically significant target. Sozin's vision was nothing less than the Fire Nation controlling the entire world, and the Earth Kingdom stood between that vision and its realization like a wall, which is an appropriate metaphor because the Earth Kingdom did in fact have a wall. Ba Sing Se, the great capital city of the Earth Kingdom, surrounded by two concentric walls of almost incomprehensible scale, had stood as an unbreached fortress for centuries. It was the symbol and the substance of Earth Kingdom resistance. As long as Ba Sing Se held, the Earth Kingdom held. As long as the Earth Kingdom held, the war was not won. But Ba Sing Se was at the far end of a long road, and Sozin began at the other end of it. The Western Earth Kingdom territories fell first, overwhelmed by a military machine that had been building momentum for decades and was now running on the enhanced capability left over from the comet's passage. Fire Nation colonies were established in captured territories, settlements that were not temporary military installations but permanent civilian communities. Fire Nation families who moved into Earth Kingdom land and built Fire Nation towns on top of what had been there before. The show in Book 3 gives us a glimpse of what these colonies looked like after 50 years or more, and what you see is a genuine cultural hybrid. People who have grown up in a place so long that they belong to it, whatever the circumstances of their arrival. The colony question is one of the moral complexities the show plants in the war's aftermath and does not fully resolve, because it genuinely does not have a clean resolution. Sozin pushed the invasion eastward through the course of his reign, which lasted until 20 AG. For 20 years of the war, the Fire Lord who started it directed its progress personally, and in that time the Fire Nation established enough of a foothold in the Earth Kingdom that the war became self-sustaining, no longer dependent on any single leader's vision to continue. What Sozin did not manage, what none of them managed until Azula, was the breaching of Ba Sing Se's walls. The Fire Nation's attempts to reach Ba Sing Se began early and repeated themselves throughout the war with a rhythm that became almost cyclical. Each attempt was different. The strategies evolved. The scale increased. But the walls held, and the walls holding was about more than military engineering. The walls of Ba Sing Se represented the idea that the Earth Kingdom could not be fully conquered, and that idea, as long as it remained true, kept resistance alive in every captured province and refugee camp and guerrilla encampment across the continent. You can occupy territory. You cannot occupy hope. Sozin died in 20 AG without having conquered Ba Sing Se. He passed the Fire Nation, the war, and an entire century's worth of momentum to his son Azulon, who was, in some ways, an even more effective instrument of the war than his father. The water tribes, during Sozin's reign, had been a secondary concern. The northern tribes' position at the literal top of the world, accessible only by sea and waters that became increasingly hostile as you moved north, made large-scale invasion logistically difficult. The southern tribe was smaller, more vulnerable, but also less strategically important to Sozin's immediate goals. During his years of rule, Fire Nation raids on both tribes were conducted, but not with the systematic ferocity that would come later. The world at Sozin's death was a planet in the early stages of a very long transformation. The air nomads were gone. The Earth Kingdom was partially occupied and under sustained military pressure. The water tribes were frightened and on the defensive. The Avatar, the one force that might have stopped all of this, was somewhere at the bottom of the Southern Ocean, sleeping. And the war machine was just getting started. Section 5. Fire Lord Azulon, the machine grows teeth. Azulon was born into a war and grew up to be perfectly shaped by it. He was Sozin's son, raised in the culture of Fire Nation military expansion, educated in the belief that what the Fire Nation was doing in the world was correct, that the other nations needed to be either absorbed or subdued. That strength was the natural ordering principle of civilizations, and the Fire Nation simply had more of it than anyone else. He was a firebending prodigy, which in the Fire Nation meant he was celebrated, trained by the best, given the resources and the expectations of someone who the nation expected great things from. He became Fire Lord in 20 AG, and immediately demonstrated that his approach to the war was different from his father's in one crucial way. Sozin had been an ideologue. He started the war because he believed in something, a vision of Fire Nation expansion that he genuinely framed as progress. Azulon was a strategist. He pursued the war not because of its ideological framing, but because it was there, because the machinery of it was in motion, because stopping it was not something he was interested in when winning, it was still on the table. Under Azulon's direction, the Fire Nation's campaigns became more efficient and more brutal in equal measure. The conquest of the Hu Xin provinces stands as one of his most celebrated military achievements from the Fire Nation's internal perspective. The Hu Xin provinces were a cluster of Earth Kingdom territories with significant strategic value, their position allowing the Fire Nation to establish a more secure supply corridor deeper into the continent, and Azulon took them with a campaign that demonstrated the kind of patient, layered military thinking that made him so dangerous. He did not simply overwhelm them. He cut off their supply lines first, isolated their defenders, and then applied force to an opponent that could no longer replenish what it lost. Economical, efficient, merciless. The Battle of Garsai is another name that echoes through Fire Nation military history from this period. The details of the battle are not fully spelled out in what the show gives us directly, but the battle's result was a significant expansion of Fire Nation territory and a corresponding collapse of Earth Kingdom defensive lines in that region. Azulon was present for it. He was not a Fire Lord who directed battles from comfortable distance. He fought, personally, and that personal ferocity set a tone for his military that his subordinate commanders understood and emulated. What Azulon also did during his reign, and this is the part that the show asks us to feel rather than just understand, was turn the war's attention to the Southern Water Tribe with a focused, systematic cruelty. The Southern Raiders. Even the name has a particular quality to it, a bluntness that does not attempt to dress itself up. They were a specialized unit of the Fire Nation Navy created by Azulon with one specific purpose: to eliminate the waterbenders of the Southern Water Tribe. Not to defeat the Southern Water Tribe in battle, not to occupy its territory, to kill or capture every waterbender it contained, one by one, through repeated surgical raids over the course of many decades, until none remained. The strategic logic behind this was connected to the Avatar cycle. The next avatar after Aang would be a Water Tribe avatar, and a Southern Water Tribe avatar with access to a community of trained waterbenders would be far more dangerous than an avatar born into a tribe that had been systematically stripped of its benders. Azulon saw the waterbenders of the South not as soldiers to be defeated, but as a resource to be depleted, and the Southern Raiders were his instrument for that depletion. 40 years into the 100-Year War, When the southern tribe was still a prosperous, functioning community, the raids began with bombardments, full naval attacks that destroyed villages and drove the population away from the coast. These early raids were overwhelming in scale, the kind that announce an intention and make an impression. But as the tribe's capacity to resist diminished, the raids changed shape. They became smaller, more targeted. The southern raiders stopped trying to destroy the tribe wholesale and started looking for specific individuals, following intelligence about who the benders were, arriving in the middle of the night, taking what they came for, and leaving. What they took was people, living people who were put on Fire Nation ships and taken to Fire Nation prisons, held as captives for decades, alive but separated from everything they had been. One of these captured water benders was a woman named Hama, who would not remain captive, who would escape using a technique she discovered alone in the dark of a prison cell, and whose story we will come back to because it is one of the most important and tragic threads in the entire war. What they also took, increasingly, was lives. As resistance from the tribe's remaining benders grew more fierce, as the waterbenders understood what was being done to them and fought back, the southern raiders began killing instead of capturing. The logic was brutal and simple. A dead waterbender was no threat. A live one in a prison was a liability, and the raids continued, year after year, narrowing the tribe's waterbending population towards zero with the slow patience of a machine that knows it has time on its side. Azulon also presided over something that the show mentions but does not linger on and which is worth understanding more completely: the killing of dragons. In Avatar's world, dragons were the original firebenders. The first people to bend fire learned to do so by watching dragons and imitating them, the same way the first earthbenders learned from badger moles, the first waterbenders from the moon, the first airbenders from the sky bison. This means that dragons were not just animals in the Avatar world. They were the living source of firebending's deepest tradition, the root of the entire art. Killing a dragon was considered the highest honor a Fire Nation warrior could achieve, proof of the ultimate conquest of the most dangerous opponent. Sozin had started the practice of hunting dragons as a military honor. Azulon continued it, and under Azulon's reign, the dragons were hunted to what the world believed was extinction. The real tradition of firebending, the true living source of it, was burned out of the world in the name of prestige. What replaced it was a harder, angrier form of the art. Firebending as weapon rather than firebending as expression, the distinction that Zuko and Aang discover when they find the last two dragons and learn from them that fire is not destruction, it is life. Azulon reigned for approximately 75 years. 75 years is long enough for the world to forget what it looked like before. It is long enough for children to grow up, have children, watch those children grow up, and die themselves, all without ever knowing a world not at war. By the time Azulon's reign approached its end, the 100-Year War was not a historical event for most people alive. It was the permanent condition of existence. This is the thing that the show understands deeply and communicates in dozens of small ways across its 3 books. The war was not something that happened. It was something that was happening, continuously, to real people, every day, without interruption, for so long that the concept of not war had become theoretical. Azulon died in 95 AG, and the circumstances of his death are quiet and devastating. He did not die in battle. He was poisoned by his own daughter-in-law. The story behind this takes us inside the Fire Nation royal family in a way that illuminates the entire culture that the war had created. Azulon had 2 sons, Iroh and Ozai. Iroh was the eldest, the crown prince, the heir. But Iroh, in the 95th year of the war, had just done something unthinkable. He had withdrawn from the siege of Ba Sing Se. He had lifted a campaign that was on the edge of victory and walked away from it, because his son had died and he had lost his will to fight. In Azulon's eyes, this was not grief. This was failure. This was dishonor, on a scale that made Iroh's claim to the throne, in the Fire Lord's judgment, untenable. Ozai saw his opportunity. He went to his father and made a proposal that was breathtaking in its audacity. He argued that since Iroh had no surviving heir, the Fire Lord throne should pass to Ozai instead. Azulon, furious, refused in a way that history would not fully record. What is known is that Azulon ordered something to be done to Ozai's son Zuko, something terrible enough that Ozai's wife Ursa chose to poison the Fire Lord to prevent it, and in exchange for providing the means to do so, she disappeared, leaving her children behind, vanishing into the Earth Kingdom under a new identity, never to return to the family she loved. Azulon died, Ozai became Fire Lord, and the war entered its final phase. Section 6. The Siege of Ba, Sing Se Iroh's Grief, and the moment that changed everything. Before Ozai, before the fifth Fire Lord's cold eyes surveyed the map of a half-conquered world and began calculating his finishing move, we need to stay here for a while. We need to stay in 95 AG, in the shadow of those walls, in the season of the siege that should have ended the war but instead ended a man. Iroh was, by every military measure available to that era, one of the greatest generals the Fire Nation had ever produced. He was called the Dragon of the West, and the title was not ceremonial. He had earned it the traditional way, by claiming to have killed a dragon, a lie he told to protect the last two surviving members of a species he had chosen to spare rather than destroy, a decision that said something very specific about who Iroh already was underneath the general. He was an extraordinary firebender, a strategic thinker of rare quality, and a commander who inspired genuine loyalty rather than the fearful compliance that Azulon and later Ozai generated in their subordinates. He was also a man who loved his son more than he loved winning. Prince Lu Ten, Iroh's only child, joined his father's campaign the way Fire Nation children of a certain class were expected to join their nation's campaigns. The war was the world, and the world required participation. Lu Ten was a soldier, a young man by the time of the siege, carrying in his letters home the particular mixture of excitement and dread that every young person carries into their first real conflict. His letters to Iroh were real correspondence between a father and a child who loved each other, and the last of them that has survived in the show's extended material ends with a line that becomes, in retrospect, unbearable. Something to the effect of, "See you after we win." He did not see him after they won. The siege of Ba Sing Se lasted 600 days. 600 days. Imagine that. 1 year and 8 months of continuous military operation against a single city, of daily skirmishes and artillery exchanges, and the kind of grinding attrition that turns soldiers into something else through sheer accumulated exhaustion. The Earth Kingdom defenders inside Ba Sing Se had their own fear, their own losses, their own long nights wondering if the walls would hold. But they had the walls. They had earthbending. And they had home ground, which is worth more in a siege than almost any other factor. Iroh's forces made extraordinary progress by any historical standard. He breached the outer wall, the first military commander in the history of the war to achieve that, a feat that was considered by many in the Fire Nation to be essentially impossible, and that immediately elevated Iroh to the status of legend within his own lifetime. The outer wall breached, his forces poured into the agrarian zone, the vast farming territory that lay between the outer and inner walls of Ba Sing Se, and began the terrible work of turning that landscape into a battlefield. Urban warfare in the agrarian zone. Farm villages reduced to rubble, Earth Kingdom defenders fighting from behind earthbended barricades in fields that had been growing food the week before. The inner wall still stood, and the defenders of Ba Sing Se were not broken. Their general at the outer wall had surrendered, yes, but the city itself had not. Inside those inner walls, the Earth King's forces were still organized, still fighting, and they were making the advance through the agrarian zone extraordinarily costly. And then the news came to Iroh. Lu Ten had been killed. The circumstances vary depending on which version of the lore you follow most closely, but the essential fact is the same. His son, his only child, his reason for believing that the future he was fighting toward was worth reaching, was dead. Killed in combat during the very campaign that was supposed to be Iroh's greatest triumph. Iroh lost his will to fight. Not gradually, not through a slow erosion of motivation. He lost it the way you lose something that you did not know could be taken, completely and immediately. He had breached the outer wall of Ba Sing Se. He was positioned for what might have been the decisive campaign of the entire 100-year war. And he ordered his forces to retreat. They pulled back. The breach they had fought for 600 days to create was abandoned. The Fire Nation fell back from the walls of Ba Sing Se, and the Earth Kingdom defenders, battered and exhausted and not entirely sure what had just happened, began the slow work of rebuilding what had been damaged. The Fire Nation saw Iroh's retreat as cowardice and dishonor. His brother Ozai certainly saw it that way, or at least presented it that way to their father when making his case for the succession. But the show asks us to see something else in it, something that Iroh himself articulates years later in a scene that will break you open if you let it. The Tales of Ba Sing Se episode. Book 2, Episode 15. Iroh on a hillside, setting up a small shrine with candles and a picture of a young soldier, singing a quiet song for his dead son on the anniversary of his birth. Mako Iwamatsu, the voice actor who played Iroh in the first 2 books of the show, recorded that song before his death from cancer. The episode aired 2 months after he died. The dedication card at the end reads simply, "In honor of Mako." And the song that Iroh sings, that gentle, heartbroken song about leaves falling and seasons changing and love that does not end when the person it belongs to is gone, was one of the last recordings Mako made before he stopped being able to make them. That song is not separate from the story of the war. It is what the war did. It took a general and hollowed him out and turned him into a man who sits on hillsides and sings to his dead son. That transformation is the war's real product. Not territory, not colonization, not even the end of the air nomads, but what it does to the people who live inside it long enough to lose what they cannot bear to lose. Iroh came home from Ba Sing Se, having given up the throne, having lost his son, and carrying a grief so large that it restructured everything about him. He would spend the following years wandering. He would study from the other nations. He would learn water-bending philosophy and earth-bending philosophy and approach them not as an enemy general studying enemy tactics, but as a student who had realized that the story he had been raised inside was not the only story. He would join the Order of the White Lotus, that secret society of masters who saw the nations as connected rather than opposed, and who worked quietly across a century of war to preserve what the war was trying to destroy. He would become Uncle Iroh, the man with the tea shop and the warm laugh and the wisdom that cost him more than most people are ever asked to pay for anything. The siege of Ba Sing Se in 95 AG did not end the war, but it ended one man's participation in it the way war was supposed to be fought. And the man who stepped away from that siege became one of the most important figures in how the war eventually ended. Section 7. Fire Lord Ozai, the Final Era. Ozai is the only Fire Lord in the 100-Year War who we actually see in any sustained way, and the show makes a deliberate choice about how it shows him. For most of Books 1 and 2, Ozai is a silhouette. He sits behind screens of fire and shadow, his face never fully visible, his presence communicated entirely through the reactions of other people to him. He exists as an absence that shapes everything around it, the way a black hole is defined by the way everything nearby bends around it. The show keeps him hidden not because it does not know what he looks like, but because the hiding itself is the point. He is the Fire Lord in the abstract, before he is the Fire Lord in the concrete. The idea of absolute authority made architectural, something you sense in every room before you see it with your own eyes. When we finally see his face in Book 3, it is exactly as you expect it to be, and somehow still a small shock. He looks like the father that Zuko could have had if the right genes had been assembled slightly differently. He has Zuko's structure, his eyes, the architecture of the family underneath everything. And then he speaks, and the warmth that Zuko carries despite everything is absent, and what replaces it is something smooth and cold and completely sure of itself. Ozai became Fire Lord in 95 AG, in circumstances that required the death of his own father and the disappearance of his wife, both arranged in the space of a single night, and he moved into the role with the fluency of someone who had been preparing for it while everyone assumed someone else would hold it. He had watched Iroh fail. He had observed what failure cost, and he was not going to fail. The 5 years of Ozai's reign before Aang's return represent the most aggressive phase of Fire Nation expansion. Ozai understood that the war had been running for 95 years on the logic that it would eventually achieve total victory through gradual attrition, and he was not satisfied with gradual. He wanted to finish it. He wanted to be the one who closed the circle that Sozin had opened, the Fire Lord who transformed a century of war into a century of Fire Nation dominion over the entire world. His first major act with direct narrative consequence was the deployment of the Southern Raiders on what was intended to be a final mission. By 94 AG, the Southern Water Tribe's population of waterbenders had been reduced to, as far as Fire Nation intelligence knew, a single individual. The Southern Raiders were sent to eliminate that last waterbender and close the Southern Front permanently. When the raid came, in the night, with the black snow falling that always preceded the Raiders' arrival, it found a community that had been living under the terror of these attacks for decades, a community of elderly people and women and children and warriors without bending, and it found one young girl named Katara, who had only just discovered she could move water, and it found a woman who stepped forward in the darkness and said that she was the last waterbender. that the raiders were looking for her, that they could take her. Kya, Katara's mother, she lied to protect her daughter, offered herself in place of the child she had identified as the actual waterbender, and was killed for it by the commander of the Southern Raiders, a man named Yon Ra. Katara was 8 years old. Ozai would never know the specific consequence of that raid, the fury it planted in a girl who would become one of the most powerful waterbenders in the world, who would be standing beside the Avatar when everything finally caught up with the Fire Nation. He could not have known. But it is one of the most precise demonstrations in the show of how the war's cruelty circled back on itself, how the violence directed at the weakest, least strategically significant target imaginable turned the person who survived it into someone who would help end the war. Omashu fell under Ozai's watch. The great mountain city of the Earth Kingdom, second only to Ba Sing Se in size and significance, had held for the entire war under its aging, eccentric King Bumi. When Aang woke up and returned to the world in 99 AG, Omashu was still standing. But Ozai's forces were patient, and they were organized, and by early Book 3 of the show the city had fallen, its population displaced in an exchange so coldly managed that the episode showing it has a particular quality of administrative horror. And then there was Ba Sing Se. The fall of Ba Sing Se is the event that closes Book 2 of Avatar, and it is the show's most stunning reversal, the moment where everything that seemed to be going right turned out to be wrong in ways the audience could not have predicted. But to understand how it fell, we need to understand what had been holding it up. Ba Sing Se had not fallen during 600 days of direct military siege under Iroh. It had not fallen to any of the assaults launched over the previous century. Its walls were not just physical structures. They were maintained, in the most literal possible sense, by the will of the people inside them. And by the time Azula arrived at its gates, that will had already been compromised. The Dai Li were Ba Sing Se's secret police, an earthbending organization that had originally been created to protect the city's cultural heritage. Under Long Feng, the scheming Grand Secretariat who had effectively taken power from the sheltered and oblivious Earth King Kui, the Dai Li had become something else entirely. An instrument of control. A machine for maintaining the fiction that there was no war, that Ba Sing Se's inner walls existed apart from the conflict happening everywhere outside them. Citizens who spoke of the war were taken and brainwashed, subjected to sessions in darkened rooms where a swinging lantern and endlessly repeated phrases replaced their memories with official denials. The propaganda was so thorough, so embedded in Ba Sing Se's daily reality, that the king himself did not know his city was surrounded by a continent on fire. This is what Azula walked into. Not a city defended by unified purpose, but a city divided against itself, its security apparatus more interested in maintaining internal control than external defense. She played Long Feng and the Dai Li against each other with the kind of patient, layered manipulation that was her signature, offering Long Feng the power he wanted, and then removing it from him the moment he had served his purpose, turning his own earthbending agents against him with a speech delivered in a crystal cavern with all the calm certainty of someone who has never doubted herself for a single second in her life. Ba Sing Se fell. The Earth King fled. The Dai Li became Azula's, and the Avatar who had tried to stop it and been struck down by Azula's lightning in the cavern beneath the city was, for a brief and terrible time, dead. Truly dead, not metaphorically. His heart stopped. His eyes closed. The Avatar state, which might have prevented what happened, was extinguished. It was Katara's healing water, a small vial of water from the spirit oasis at the North Pole, that brought him back. If she had not had it, if she had not been carrying it, the war would have ended differently. Section 8. The human cost. What 100 years actually feels like. None of what I have just told you is what the war actually was. What I have told you is the structure of it. The architecture. The dates and the names and the campaigns and the turning points, the things that generals and historians talk about when they need to make sense of something too large to hold in a single thought. But the war was not made of generals and historians. It was made of people, individual people with individual lives, who did not choose to be inside it and could not choose to step outside it. Let me tell you about Hama. Hama was a Southern Water Tribe waterbender who was captured by the Southern Raiders during the decades of targeted attacks on the tribe. She was put on a Fire Nation ship and taken to a Fire Nation prison, a mountainside jail in an anonymous part of the Fire Nation that held her and other captured benders, people who had been taken from their homes and their people and put inside stone walls with no way out, no hope of rescue, no timeline. She was in that prison for decades. What Hama did inside that prison is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever describes. She experimented. She had nothing but time and a waterbender's sensitivity to the presence of water in her environment, and a prison in the Fire Nation had very little of it. No rivers, no rain most of the time, stone walls. And then one night, Hama realized something that no waterbender had realized before her, or, if they had not committed to following where it led. Living things contain water. Human bodies are mostly water, and waterbending is at its most fundamental level, the ability to sense and move water. Wherever it is, whatever form it takes, Hama invented bloodbending alone. In the dark, in a prison cell, out of desperation so complete that it had burned away every other option, she learned to reach inside the bodies of the guards and move the water in their blood, to make them open doors and turn away and let her pass. She walked out of that prison the way a ghost walks through walls, using the most intimate possible violation of another person's autonomy as the key to her own freedom. She escaped. She made it to a small coastal village in the Fire Nation, built a new life, survived. But what she brought with her was not the person she had been. The decades in that cell, the separation from her people, the invention of a technique that required her to do to other human beings what the Fire Nation had done to her, to treat them as objects to be moved rather than people with will, had changed her into something the war had made, rather than someone her own history had made. By the time Katara met her, Hama was quietly kidnapping Fire Nation villagers from the forest outside her home and imprisoning them in the same mountain cell where she had once been imprisoned. An old woman enacting the war on the only available territory. It was not justice. She knew it was not justice. But the war had taken everything she had except the capacity to make someone else feel what she had felt, and she had spent 40 years deciding to use that capacity. Katara had to use bloodbending herself to stop her. Hama smiled when it happened, because she had passed it on. The technique would survive her. That was the final thing the war had made her care about. Think about Jet, the orphaned boy from the Earth Kingdom forests, who lost his family to a Fire Nation raid and built a community of children in the trees, a little army of young people who had also lost everything and had no adults to tell them that what they were becoming was frightening. Jet was not a villain in the simple sense. He was a child who had been handed a cause and a weapon at an age when children should be learning other things, and he used them with the certainty that only the young can sustain, because they have not yet lived long enough to understand the consequences of certainty. He was willing to flood a village full of Earth Kingdom civilians to flush out Fire Nation soldiers. He had made the calculation, the cold arithmetic of a war that had been running his entire life, that the lives of innocent people in the village could be placed on one side of a scale against Fire Nation soldiers, and that the scale tipped. He was wrong. He knew he was wrong when Aang made him see it, and the knowing broke something in him that the rest of his short life was spent trying to put back together. He died in Ba Sing Se, brainwashed by the Dai Li and then shaken partially free and then killed by Long Feng or Azula or the consequences of the city itself, the details deliberately unclear because the war's specific kills are often unclear, and the ambiguity is part of the point. Jet died in a captured city, trying to be better than what the war had made him, not quite making it. Think about the refugees on the Serpent's Pass. Book 2. The group of Earth Kingdom families fleeing toward Ba Sing Se, carrying what they could carry, moving through dangerous terrain toward a city that would turn out to be no refuge at all. Among them, a pregnant woman, Ying, who gives birth to her daughter on the shore of the lake on the other side of the pass, in the middle of flight, in the middle of loss, and names her Hope because the war had taken everything that name was supposed to celebrate, and she named her child after it anyway. That is what 100 years of war looks like at the level where history cannot reach it. Think about the Southern Water Tribe as Katara and Sokka know it. A handful of tents on the ice, their grandmother. A few other elders, women and children, because the men are away fighting a war on someone else's front, in someone else's war, so far from the South Pole that the logistics of returning home are almost impossible. The tribe reduced from something that once had size and weight and community to a small cluster of people, keeping the fire going in the dark, passing down the stories of what used to be here, preserving the shape of a culture in the absence of most of the people who made it. Sokka grew up as the oldest male in that camp. That is the war too. A teenage boy taking on the weight of being the man of a village that had no men, not because he chose it, but because everything that might have allowed him to choose differently had been taken before he was old enough to know what was being taken. Think about the colonized Earth Kingdom territories. The people who had been living under Fire Nation administration for 2, 3, 4 generations. People who had never known anything but Fire Nation rule. Whose parents had never known anything but Fire Nation rule. Who spoke Fire Nation and wore Fire Nation clothing, and attended Fire Nation schools where the history they were taught was the history the Fire Nation had decided they should know. Not monsters. Not even, in many cases, people who experienced their own lives as oppressed, because the oppression had become the normal, and the normal has a way of becoming invisible. This is the human cost of 100 years. Not just the lives ended, but the lives bent into shapes that the people living them did not choose and cannot entirely see. The identity erased. The culture preserved only in whispers, in old songs that grandmothers remember, in water-bending scrolls hidden in back rooms, in the practice of saying the old words in private, because the public vocabulary has been replaced. Section 9. Aang's Return, the year that ends 100 years. In 99 AG, Katara and Sokka of the Southern Water Tribe broke open an iceberg. This is where the show begins, and this is where the last chapter of the 100-Year War begins, though no one knew it yet. When the light from that iceberg shot into the sky, all that Katara and Sokka saw was a boy. A bald, tattooed, grinning, 12-year-old boy who had woken up from 100 years of dreamless sleep with no idea that the world he had run away from no longer existed. Aang's return was the thing the war had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure for a century. The Fire Nation had spent 100 years operating in the absence of the Avatar. That absence had been their greatest strategic advantage and their most persistent anxiety. Sozin had tried to kill the Avatar before it became a problem. For the next 99 years, the Fire Nation operated under the assumption that the Avatar was either dead, permanently hidden, or lost, and structured its military campaigns around a world where the one force capable of individually challenging the entire Fire Nation no longer functioned as a constraint. When Aang woke up, that changed overnight. Zuko found out first, essentially. The young, exiled Fire Nation prince pursuing the Avatar as the condition of his return home was the Fire Nation's first contact with the resurgent Avatar, and the irony of his position, a prince in exile who needed the Avatar captured to restore his honor, racing to find a boy who had just woken up with no idea how much was riding on their encounter, is one of the show's most elegant structural setups. What followed was the year depicted across Avatar's 3 books, the year that ended the war. It was not a clean year. It was not a series of escalating victories leading smoothly to a final triumph. It was a year of losses and reversals and moments where everything seemed to be collapsing, where the war's momentum seemed too great and too old to redirect. Ba Sing Se fell. The Dai Li switched sides. The Earth King fled. Aang was struck down by Azula's lightning and was clinically dead for a period that is still debated in how long it lasted, but was long enough that the world believed the Avatar cycle had been broken for the first time since its creation. He came back, Katara brought him back, and the war went into its final phase. After the fall of Ba Sing Se and the Shaken, regrouped Team Avatar hiding out in various places across the world, the idea for the Day of Black Sun invasion took shape. It had actually been developed before Ba Sing Se fell, planned in coordination with the Earth Kingdom military, designed as the moment when a solar eclipse, which stripped all firebenders of their power for a window of time, would be used to launch a direct assault on the Fire Nation capital and end Ozai's reign by force. The eclipse plan was strategic, it was bold, and it was compromised. Azula, during her infiltration of Ba Sing Se, had encountered the Earth King and extracted the information about the invasion plan from him, and the Fire Nation used those months to prepare. When the invasion force arrived at the Fire Nation capital on the Day of Black Sun, they found that Ozai and his court had retreated underground into bunkers built specifically for this contingency. The eclipse came and went, and when firebending returned, the invasion force was met with the full force of the Fire Nation military, including a new weapon that no one outside the Fire Nation had known existed. The airships. The Fire Nation had been developing them quietly. a fleet of enormous war vessels that moved through the air rather than the sea, that could project fire from altitudes no earthbender could reach, that turned the ground forces' defensive capabilities nearly irrelevant. When the airships deployed above the Day of Black Sun invasion force, the battle was effectively over. The invasion failed. Most of its members were captured. But it was not a total failure, and the show makes this clear in retrospect. Several critical things happened on the Day of Black Sun that the Fire Nation did not fully account for. Aang escaped. Sokka and Toph and Katara escaped. And Zuko, finally, irrevocably, permanently, chose a side. Zuko's confrontation with his father on the Day of Black Sun, in the underground bunker while the eclipse muted all firebending, is one of the most important scenes in the series, because of what Zuko does and does not do. He faces Ozai. He tells him the truth. He rejects the entire foundation of his father's claim on him and on the world. And when Ozai strikes lightning at him, Zuko catches it, holds it, redirects it harmlessly away, and walks out of that bunker and out of his father's orbit forever. He flew on a stolen ostrich horse to find his uncle. The reunion between Zuko and Iroh, in a tent at the White Lotus camp outside Ba Sing Se, is the scene that makes everything before it makes sense. Iroh weeping, Zuko on his knees. No words needed, or rather, the few words that are spoken are less important than the silence between them. The silence of two people who had been circling toward this for 3 books, one of them endlessly making the wrong choice, the other endlessly waiting with an open hand. In the months after the Day of Black Sun, the final pieces assembled. Zuko joined Team Avatar. He offered to teach Aang firebending, the last element Aang needed to master before facing Ozai. They sought the true source of firebending, the 2 surviving dragons that the world believed extinct, hidden in the ruins of the ancient Sun Warriors civilization. Ran and Shaw, the last dragons, taught them both something that no firebending instruction in the Fire Nation military tradition had preserved, that fire is not destruction and dominance. Fire is life. Fire is the energy of the world given form. The same force that warms you is the same force that burns you, and which one it is depends entirely on the intention of the person bending it. Zuko and Aang stood inside the fire of those dragons, and felt something that Sozin's ideology had spent a century suppressing. The original truth of their element. Section 10. Sozin's comet returns the last day of the war. The war was supposed to end before the comet arrived. That was always the plan. Get Aang to face Ozai before Sozin's comet returned, before the amplification of every firebender in the world gave Ozai a window of power so absolute that even the Avatar state might not be enough to counter it. The comet was returning in exactly 100 years, on the last day of summer, arriving again in the same sky where it had first arrived on the night the air nomads died, closing the circle. The plan did not happen the way anyone intended, because nothing in the war ever did. Aang, in the weeks before the comet's arrival, went into a kind of spiritual crisis that manifested as a coma. He had been wrestling with the central impossible problem of his situation. The only way he knew to end the war was to kill Ozai, and Aang could not kill. Not because he was weak, not because he lacked the power or even, in the end, the resolve, but because he was an air nomad, raised in a tradition that treated all life as sacred, that had defined nonviolence as a spiritual practice rather than a tactical preference. The monks had raised him inside a moral framework that the war was demanding he abandon, and he could not simply abandon it because the war wanted him to. He disappeared. He fell asleep, or fell into the ocean, or was swallowed by a lion turtle. The exact spiritual mechanics are secondary to the emotional fact, which is that the Avatar was missing again 3 days before the comet arrived, and the team had no idea where he was. Meanwhile, Ozai was not waiting. He had declared himself Phoenix King before the comet came, a title that made explicit what Sozin's original vision had always implied, that the Fire Lord's dominion was not merely national but universal, not merely the leader of one nation but the supreme ruler of everything. He delegated the title of Fire Lord to Azula and assigned himself a task worthy of a Phoenix King's first act of the New Age. With Sozin's comet amplifying every firebender in his air fleet, Ozai intended to fly across the Earth Kingdom and burn it. Not capture it, not colonize it, burn it, all of it. Reduce the largest nation in the world to ash. Leave its millions of surviving inhabitants scattered and broken in a landscape that could no longer support them, and in doing so eliminate the one remaining force capable of sustained resistance to Fire Nation dominion. It was a plan that made the Air Nomad genocide look like a targeted operation. The Air Nomad genocide had been a surgical strike at a specific people to eliminate a specific threat. What Ozai was planning was the largest act of destruction in the history of the Avatar world. Aang found a lion turtle in the ocean. Or it found him. The lion turtle, one of the oldest beings in the world, older than the Avatar cycle itself, older than the Four Nations, older than the traditions of bending as they had been practiced for 10,000 years, gave him something. Not a lesson in how to bend, a different understanding of bending entirely. A technique so old that it predated all of the show's established categories. Energy bending. The ability to reach into another person's energy, the fundamental life force that underlies all bending, and either give bending or take it away permanently. Aang came back. The day of the comet arrived. The final battles of the 100-Year War happened simultaneously in 4 locations, each one the conclusion of a story that had been building across 3 years of the show. Sokka, Toph, and Suki went after the airship fleet above the Earth Kingdom, an almost impossibly dangerous mission against a fleet of enormous, fire-projecting vessels staffed by comet-amplified firebenders at the height of their power. They did it anyway. Toph, without a scrap of earth and reached thousands of feet in the air, improvised metal-bending applications that had never been tried, essentially treating the airship hull around her as a vehicle she could control with her bare feet. The fleet was destroyed. Not all of it, not without extraordinary cost and danger, but enough of it that the burning of the Earth Kingdom did not happen. Iroh and the Order of the White Lotus retook Ba Sing Se, the secret society which had been slowly assembling its most powerful members for exactly this kind of moment, emerged from the city's walls with firebenders and earthbenders and waterbenders and sword fighters fighting together, fighting for a world rather than a nation, and they pushed the Fire Nation occupation out of the city with a force and a coordination that the occupation had no framework to understand. An army that did not fit inside the war's categories. Zuko and Katara faced Azula at her coronation, interrupting the ceremony that would have made her Fire Lord, issuing the challenge for an Agni Kai that Azula accepted. The final fight between brother and sister was shot the way the show told us it would feel, like a funeral. Slow and wide and scored with something that sits between grief and awe. Azula's fire was blue and growing erratic, her mental stability fracturing under the pressure of Mai and Ty Lee's betrayal, under the weight of a perfectionism that had finally encountered something it could not control. Zuko's fire was steady. The fight could have gone differently. It almost went differently when Azula changed her target at the last second and sent a lightning bolt toward Katara rather than Zuko. Zuko intercepted it, took the full force of a lightning strike from his sister's comet-amplified power directly into his body. Katara finished it, not brutally. She used water and ice to contain Azula without killing her, while Zuko lay on the ground recovering from a bolt of lightning that should have killed him. Azula, on her knees, chained to a drain in the courtyard, wept. Not the calculated tears of manipulation, real ones. The ones that come when everything you built your identity on turns out not to be enough. And Aang found Ozai, the Phoenix King, in the air above the Earth Kingdom, riding the power of the comet with his entire fleet behind him. Certain that this was the moment Sozin had been pointing toward for 100 years, the day when everything that the Fire Nation had promised itself it would become finally became real. What he found instead was the Avatar. The fight between Aang and Ozai is the most spectacular extended sequence of bending combat in the entire show, and it is also, deliberately, a fight that Aang does not win through superior firepower. Ozai, with the comet's amplification, hits harder, burns hotter, and projects fire in ways that make the air itself look like it is catching. The natural advantage in a direct contest of comet-enhanced firebending against one young airbender, even the Avatar, was not Aang's. He survived through evasion, through the exact airbending philosophy that his culture had always embodied. Do not oppose, redirect. Do not plant your feet, move with. He lost access to the Avatar state. He was pushed to the edge of consciousness. He found something in himself, or something in himself found him, and the Avatar state came back, and for a moment Aang was everything he was supposed to be, the culmination of 10,000 years of Avatars, the accumulated power of every life in the cycle, and Ozai in the face of that was outmatched. And then Aang made the choice that no one expected and that Zuko had asked about directly in the episode before the finale, standing on a clifftop with the question hanging in the air. He did not kill Ozai. He used the energy-bending technique the lion turtle had given him, reached into Ozai's fundamental connection to firebending and severed it permanently, left Ozai alive but without the power that had defined him his entire life. It was a third option. Not the violence the world had been running on for 100 years. Not the pacifism that would have required Aang to let Ozai go free. Something new. Something that came from a tradition so old that even the Avatar cycle had not preserved it. Found at the last possible moment by a boy who refused to give up on the idea that there was a way through that did not require him to become what he was fighting against. Ozai sat down in the dirt above the burning Earth Kingdom, and the fire went out. The war was over. Zuko was crowned Fire Lord at a ceremony that the show stages simply and without excess. He stood in the armor of his nation and said that he wanted to begin an era of peace and love. He was 16 years old. He was the youngest Fire Lord in recorded history. He had essentially no model for what a just ruler looked like, because the models he had inherited were Ozai and Azulon and Sozin, 3 generations of men who had treated the world as a resource and its people as instruments. What he had was Iroh, who had taught him that the wisdom to lead came from understanding connection and the memory of every choice he had made and every choice he wished he had made differently. It was enough to start. Section 11. What the war left behind. The weight of 100 years. The 100-Year War ended in 100 AG on the day Sozin's comet arrived for the second time. But the ending of a war and the ending of what a war does are not the same event. The war was over in the sense that the fighting stopped, that the Fire Lord conceded, that the immediate threat of continued military conquest was removed. The war was not over in the sense of the damage being undone, the losses restored, the century of accumulated consequence somehow reversed by the defeat of one man on one afternoon. Think about what the world looked like on the day after. The air nomad nation was gone, not wounded, not reduced, gone. The 4 air temples stood empty of people, their grounds holding a century of weather and neglect and the bones of those who had died defending them. There was one airbender in the world, one, a 12-year-old boy who had spent 100 years in ice, and came out the other side with an intact culture living only in his memory and his practice. The air temples could be visited. The teachings could be recovered from surviving scrolls. The sky bison, some of them, were found alive on the grounds of a hidden temple, suggesting that the species had survived better than the people. But the community was gone, and communities are not rebuilt from architectural plans and textual records. They are rebuilt by people, and the air nomads had one person. This is one of the things Avatar does not resolve, because it cannot be resolved. The genocide of the air nomads is not something that 4 seasons of television or however many graphic novels can undo. The show honors that fact by not pretending otherwise. The Southern Water Tribe was a shadow of what it had been. Its waterbenders had been systematically eliminated for 60 years. Katara was the last one remaining in the south, and she had survived only because her mother had died in her place. The tribe's population was small. Its structures were minimal. Its men were scattered across the war's various fronts. The peace would allow them to begin the work of rebuilding. But rebuilding a community that has been deliberately targeted for destruction over the course of 6 decades is not a project that completes itself in a few years. The Earth Kingdom was the most visually dramatic case because the scale of Fire Nation presence there was so extensive. Colonies that had existed for generations. People who had been born into the colonized world who had no other world to return to. The political question of what to do with those colonies was genuinely unresolvable in the short term, a problem that the Legend of Korra would revisit in its narrative, as the specific geography of those old colonies became its own nation-state. The displacement, the refugees, the shattered provincial governments, the damaged infrastructure, the psychological weight of a century of occupation on the Earth Kingdom's cultural identity as the largest and supposedly most formidable nation, all of this was there in the peace and did not vanish because the war ended. And the Fire Nation itself. This is the part that is easy to miss and that the show asks you not to miss. The Fire Nation's people were not the Fire Lord. They were not the army's generals or the Southern Raiders' commanders. They were millions of ordinary people who had been raised inside a story that told them they were the heroes of history, that their nation's expansion was the forward motion of civilization, that the world outside their borders was primitive and backward and fortunate to be receiving the Fire Nation's attention. They had never, in most cases, chosen this story. They had been born into it. They had learned it in schools. They had celebrated the victories it described. Some of them had sent their children to fight in it. The defeat of Ozai did not automatically rewrite the story they had been living inside. It created a new political reality, yes. A new Fire Lord with radically different intentions, yes. But the story is not in the politics. It is in the hearts of people, and changing hearts is slower than changing governments. This is why Zuko's first act as Fire Lord matters so much, and why the show gives it the weight it does. He was not just ending a military campaign. He was beginning the project of telling his own people a different story about themselves, of building an identity for the Fire Nation that was not built on conquest, of asking a nation that had spent 100 years believing itself the rightful master of the world to understand itself differently. It would take generations. It would be contested. It would be resisted in some quarters and embraced in others, and the borderlands between those positions would be where the real work happened. There is a scene late in the show, after the comet and before the credits, that I want to hold for a moment because I think it is the most honest thing the show does about what peace is. Zuko goes to see his father in prison. He goes alone. He goes without an agenda of revenge or punishment beyond what has already happened. He goes partly to ask where his mother is, a question Ozai has the answer to and uses as the last leverage available to him, dangling it like a rope over a pit. But Zuko also goes because Ozai is still his father, and what the war did to their relationship is also something the war did, and it is not cleanly undone by a comet and a coronation. Ozai, powerless, sitting in a prison cell, still behaves like a Fire Lord, still holds himself like someone who believes the world owes him something. The belief does not require the power to sustain itself. That is what is most frightening about it. The show does not offer us Ozai's redemption. It is honest about the fact that some things do not redeem. Some ideologies go too deep to be excavated by circumstances, however dire. Sozin had built something in the Fire Nation's culture that outlasted his own life by a century, and Ozai had been its most recent and most complete product. What you do with someone like that is a different question than what you do with the war. Iroh. We have to talk about what the war left Iroh. In the piece, Iroh opened his tea shop, the Jasmine Dragon in Ba Sing Se, named after a real type of tea, Jasmine Dragon Pearl, a high-quality Chinese green tea scented with jasmine blossoms, associated with refinement and patience and the appreciation of subtlety, which are three qualities that define everything Iroh ever became after the siege. He made tea for everyone who came in. He sat across from strangers and asked what they needed, and listened to the answer. It is the smallest possible response to 100 years of war, and it is exactly right. Iroh did not end the war. He did not lead the decisive battle or develop the crucial strategy. What he did was preserve, inside himself, across decades of loss and wandering and watching the war consume everything it touched, the conviction that the small things matter. That tea matters. That warmth offered to a stranger matters. That civilization is built not in the grand gestures of generals and fire lords, but in the 10,000 small acts of connection that people perform for each other when the world does not make it easy. He was in Ba Sing Se when the White Lotus retook it. He was there at the front of it, old and soft-looking and dangerous in ways that the Fire Nation soldiers he was facing could not have anticipated, releasing fire from himself that was not the angry, aggressive, outward-pushing fire of standard military training, but something older and calmer and paradoxically more powerful for being rooted in something other than fury. He fought to take Ba Sing Se back, and then he went and made tea. And the war that had been made of big things, of genocides and sieges and political coups and century-scale military campaigns, ended in the small things. A boy in a cell by the sea meditating on how to spare a life he had every right to take. A woman using healing water to bring back the person she needed the world not to lose. Two siblings fighting in the blue and orange of their own fire while the camera watched from a respectful distance. An old general with an open door and a pot on the stove. Section 12. The Long Echo. Why the 100-Year War Never Really Ends. The 100-Year War officially ended in 100 AG. Most sources will tell you that. The date is on the record. But here is what I want to leave you with. Katara never forgave the man who killed her mother. She tracked him down to his village in retirement and stood over him with the power to end him, and she chose not to end him. and she said clearly that her decision was not forgiveness. It was the refusal to let what he had done reduce her to what he was. The war's specific cruelty had landed on her at the age of 8 and had been living inside her ever since, and the choice she made over that retired soldier did not heal it. What it did was refuse to feed it. That is what peace is, in the real sense, not the absence of what happened, not the erasure of the century. It is the refusal to keep paying, to keep extending the credit that violence takes from the people who survive it. Zuko spent years after the war searching for his mother. This search, which the graphic novels explore in detail, is itself the war's continuation in private, the personal consequences of what the Fire Nation's culture had required of its royal family, the impossible position it had put a woman in when it forced her to choose between her husband and her son. The war's damage to the Ursa-Zuko relationship was not healed by Ozai's defeat. It was simply given the space to begin healing without new wounds being added to it. The Earth Kingdom colonies would be contested for the next 70 years. The political problem that became the Republic City solution, the compromise that created an entirely new kind of nation out of what had been a wound. It was not justice in the clean sense, but it was livable, which is what most real peace actually looks like on the ground. What the show knows, and what I think is worth sitting with in the long quietness after all this lore, is that the 100-Year War is not a story about evil being defeated. It is a story about a pattern being interrupted. Sozin started the pattern. His belief that one nation's way of living was worth imposing on the entire world at the cost of all other ways of living. Azulon maintained it with efficiency. Ozai accelerated it toward its most extreme expression. Each generation inherited the pattern from the one before, made it a little more themselves, passed it on, and the thing that interrupted it was not a superior military strategy. It was a boy who refused to kill. Not because he could not because the opportunity never came, because he had grown up inside a tradition that told him that all life was connected, that you could not end one life without diminishing everything, and he held on to that tradition through everything the war had thrown at it, through the death of his people and his own death and his world being unrecognizable to him, and everyone telling him that his values were a luxury that the stakes could not afford. He held on to it and found a third option. That is the show's deepest lore. Not the dates and the campaigns and the Fire Lords. Not the mechanics of the comet or the logistics of the invasion. The deepest lore is that a 12-year-old boy, born into a culture of nonviolence that had been annihilated before he was old enough to carry it, carried it anyway through 100 years of ice and a year of war, and at the moment of maximum pressure, instead of letting it go, discovered that it was the only thing in his hands that the war could not use. The world of Avatar is a world that the 100-Year War changed forever. The air nomads are gone. The geography is redrawn. The cultures are altered in ways that will take generations to fully understand. Nothing that was lost is coming back. But the world is a world again, rather than a project. And there is a difference between those two things, and the difference is what 100 years of war costs, and what all those fires and all that grief and all those ordinary people living inside a history they did not make finally, barely, impossibly purchased. A world. If you made it to the end of this, I genuinely cannot explain how much I appreciate you. This is exactly what this channel is for. The long sit with something worth understanding all the way down to its roots. If you want more of this, subscribing is free, and it tells me this kind of content is worth making. Drop a like if you got something out of this, and I'll see you in the next one. Script length: approximately 21,500 words. Bonus section: the Fire Nation's internal transformation. What war does to the nation that wages it. There is a version of this story that only looks at the victims of the 100-Year War. The air nomads, the water tribes, the Earth Kingdom. The displaced, the bereaved, the colonized, the erased. And that version is true and important and should not be softened or skipped over. But there is another layer underneath it that the show does not ignore, and that I want to give its own space, because it answers a question that sits just beneath the surface of Avatar's entire story. How does a nation sustain 100 years of war? How do you keep an entire civilization pointed at a single objective across the lifetimes of multiple generations? How does the ordinary person in the Fire Nation, the farmer and the shopkeeper and the schoolchild, how do they live inside this project and not question it? The answer is not simply that they are kept in the dark, though some of that happens. The answer is more complicated and more uncomfortable. The answer is that the war requires the Fire Nation to continuously and thoroughly transform the way its own people understand themselves and their place in the world, and that this transformation leaves marks on the culture of the Fire Nation that are just as deep, in their own way, as the marks left on the nations they are fighting. Book 3 of the show gives us access to the Fire Nation's interior in a way that books 1 and 2 by necessity cannot. When Aang goes undercover in the Fire Nation school, what he finds is not a society of people who have chosen evil and know it. He finds people who have been educated into a worldview so complete that the question of whether it is true or just never occurs to most of them, because the question has been made to feel unnecessary. The school curriculum teaches Fire Nation history from the inside out. The war is not called a war in the way Aang would understand a war. It is called something more like a mission, a great undertaking. The Fire Nation's role in the world is framed as pedagogical rather than military. They are teaching the other nations how to live better, and the force they are using is not aggression but the necessary difficulty that all meaningful improvement requires. Suffering is reframed as growth. Conquest is reframed as civilizing. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, the standard apparatus of any empire that wishes to sustain itself beyond the first generation of people who chose to build it. You cannot force every subsequent generation to choose conquest again from scratch. You have to build it into their self-conception at a level deeper than choice. You have to make it feel like identity rather than ideology. The Fire Nation's schools, its ceremonies, its public culture, its children's songs, all of it points in the same direction. We are the bright ones. We are the advanced ones. The rest of the world is waiting for what we carry. The children who grew up inside this believed it, because why would they not? Children believe what the world around them shows them is true. And the world around Fire Nation children showed them something coherent, something that had internal logic, something that explained the news and the maps and the statues in the town square, and the stories their grandparents told. It all fit together. And things that fit together feel like the truth even when they are not. What the show does with this, and what I find genuinely remarkable about it, is that it refuses to let the Fire Nation's ordinary citizens off the hook with simple victimhood, and also refuses to condemn them as uniformly complicit. The girl in Aang's Fire Nation class who pulls him aside and tells him to be careful, who has clearly been noticing things that do not add up, that girl is the Fire Nation too. The students who genuinely, enthusiastically celebrate the Fire Nation's military victories in song during class, those students are the Fire Nation too. The teacher who enforces the curriculum with the tired energy of someone who learned what they are teaching from teachers who were equally tired, that person is the Fire Nation too. And Zuko is the Fire Nation. Zuko, who spent 3 books trying to be what the Fire Nation had told him he was supposed to be, and discovering that the self he was trying to reconstruct had been built out of materials that did not fit him, is the most complete portrait the show offers of what it is like to be born into a country with 100 years of momentum behind its worst impulses, and to have to figure out, from inside, that the momentum is wrong. His journey is not just personal. It is the model for what the Fire Nation as a whole would eventually have to do. Examine the story. Find the places where it does not account for the people it erased. Feel the discomfort of that accounting, and choose, despite the discomfort, to continue accounting. There is the scene where Zuko goes to the fire sages and destroys the statue of Ozai's face. No ceremony, no speech. He just dismantles the symbol of what the country had been pointing toward, and he does it by hand, quietly, without an audience. That is what the internal transformation of a nation looks like at its most granular level. One choice, one act, one removed symbol, in a room without witnesses. The Fire Nation also lost something to the war that the show touches on only lightly, but that is worth naming. It lost firebending itself, in the sense of what firebending was supposed to be. The show reveals this through the Sun Warriors arc. The original firebenders, the people who first bent fire before the Fire Nation was a nation, related to fire as Ran and Shaw, the last 2 dragons, demonstrate it. Fire as energy. Fire as connection to the life force of the world. Fire as something that flows and breathes and chooses, that can warm and illuminate as readily as it can burn. The tradition the Fire Nation's military preserved was a different relationship with fire, one in which the element's destructive capacity was cultivated above all else, where the students were taught to draw from anger and aggression and the will to dominate, rather than from the broader, more difficult source of genuine vitality. This is not just a bending style. It is a spiritual impoverishment, an entire culture cut off from the deepest truth of its own element by the demands of sustaining a war machine that needed soldiers who could project maximum firepower rather than artists who could express the full range of what fire is. The war damaged the Fire Nation's relationship with its own element, and that damage was not obvious because the fire still burned, the soldiers could still fight, the empire was still expanding, but something was missing, and no one had the language to name what it was, because the tradition that would have given them that language had been extinguished along with the dragons. When Zuko faces Aang across a training ground in Book 3 to try to teach him firebending and cannot produce a flame, the reason is not weakness, it is honesty. He has given up the anger that his fire was built on, and found that there is nothing behind the anger to replace it yet. He has to go back to the beginning. He has to find what fire actually is before he can use it correctly. And that journey back to the beginning, to the Sun Warriors and the dragons, is the Fire Nation's journey back to itself compressed into one young man's arc. After the war, Zuko inherited not just a nation but a wounded tradition, a culture of fire that had been deliberately narrowed for a century. Part of what it meant to rebuild the Fire Nation in peace was to allow that tradition to breathe again, to return to what firebending was before it was exclusively a weapon. The Fire Nation's story in the 100-Year War is a story about what you become when you commit to being only one thing for long enough. The Fire Nation committed to being conquerors. It built everything around that commitment. Its schools, its arts, its ceremonies, its family structures, its understanding of honor and strength and identity, and the commitment delivered. The Fire Nation was extraordinarily effective at conquest. It nearly achieved total global domination. The commitment worked, and it hollowed the culture out from the inside, leaving behind something that looked powerful and was, in the particular ways that power is measured by force, genuinely powerful, but that had lost access to the parts of itself that were not useful for war. The creativity, the connection, the willingness to be uncertain, the capacity to find fire in warmth rather than in destruction. Iroh found all of those things again, in exile, by deliberately walking away from the commitment and into everything the commitment had required him to avoid. He learned from the Earth Kingdom. He learned from the Water Tribes. He carried their knowledge alongside his own and let it change his understanding of what his element was and what his nation could be. He became the most complete person in the show, in the sense of wholeness, because he had most thoroughly examined what the war had cost and most deliberately chosen to pay it back. He is the model for the Fire Nation's long healing. Not Zuko, though Zuko matters enormously. Iroh, sitting with a cup of tea across from anyone who needed it, offering warmth without conditions, treating the small acts of human connection as the serious work that they are. That is what 100 years of war eventually has to come back to. Not monuments and peace treaties, though those matter, the cup of tea, the open door, the willingness to sit across from someone you were taught to see as less than yourself and simply see them. Bonus Section 2, The Geography of Loss, How the War Rewrote the Map. Before we close, I want to spend some time with something that the show communicates through production design and geography rather than dialogue, because it is easy to absorb without naming it, and naming it changes how you understand the world. The 100-Year War did not just affect the nations as political entities, it rewrote the physical geography of the Avatar world in ways that are visible in every episode of the show, embedded in the landscape itself. Start with the air temples. All 4 of them are still standing. The Western Air Temple hangs upside down from a cliff face over a gorge, its architecture defying gravity in a way that feels impossible, and is achieved through the air nomad's unique relationship with height and with improbability. The Eastern Air Temple is on a mountain range. The Northern is remote, its location difficult to find even for someone looking. The Southern is where Aang grew up and where the show first confronts us with what was lost. When Aang and the group arrive at the Southern Air Temple in Book 1, what they find is not ruins. The temples are not destroyed. They did not fall. The Fire Nation did not demolish the physical architecture because there was no strategic reason to, and because demolishing mountain temples is difficult even with comet-amplified firebending. What happened instead is the emptying of them. The people are gone. The bison are gone. The sound is gone. The sense of inhabited space, of a place that has been shaped by daily life and daily practice over centuries, is gone. What remains is the architecture without the culture. Walls and corridors and training grounds and libraries, all preserved by altitude and stone, and the absence of people who would have worn them down through use. It is immaculate and terrible. The way a museum is immaculate, the way a room that no one has entered in 100 years is immaculate, the way any space is immaculate when the thing that would have made it imperfect has been removed. Aang walking through the Southern Air Temple is the show's first sustained image of what genocide looks like from the inside of what it erased. Not bodies, not blood, just the absence of a people where the shape of their lives used to be. Move to the Southern Water Tribe. In the very first episode, before we understand anything about the political context, the camera gives us a long establishing shot of the tribe's location, and it tells us everything without needing to say anything. A few tents. A wall of ice that suggests something larger was once there. A handful of people. The scale is small in a way that feels wrong. The way a room with most of its furniture removed feels wrong. The proportions intact but the density off. As the show fills in the context, we understand that the smallness is not the tribe's original scale. The Southern Water Tribe was once comparable to the Northern Water Tribe in population and in cultural richness. Its waterbenders maintained a tradition that paralleled the North's. Its architecture, presumably, was more extensive. More people means more built environment, more social infrastructure, more institutions. All of that has been stripped away over 60 years of targeted raids. What remains is what could not be taken, the knowledge of the people who survived. The stories passed down in the absence of the institutions that used to carry them. The particular stubborn tenacity that characterizes communities that have survived being targeted for destruction. The Southern Water Tribe is small and poor and cold and undefended, and it is still there, still practicing, still telling the stories, still producing people like Katara and Sokka who turn out to be exactly what the world needs. The Earth Kingdom's geography was rewritten more overtly than either of the other affected nations, because the Fire Nation's expansion into it was a physical occupation rather than an erasure, and occupation leaves its marks differently. The Western Earth Kingdom territories are, by the time the show takes place, extensively colonized. Fire Nation settlements have been built on Earth Kingdom land for 50, 60, 70 years. The architecture is Fire Nation. The culture is Fire Nation. Fire Nation flags hang where Earth Kingdom banners once flew. The people living in these territories are a mixture of original Earth Kingdom population living under Fire Nation administration and Fire Nation families who settled there generations ago and have no other home. This creates the specific kind of geographic ambiguity that colonization always creates. Whose land is it? The answer is not simply that the Fire Nation took it and therefore it belongs to the Earth Kingdom. People have been born and raised on that land, under Fire Nation culture. Their ancestors came from the Fire Nation, they speak Fire Nation. The Earth Kingdom population who lived under their administration for 70 years has adapted, coexisted, sometimes integrated, sometimes resisted. The lines that were clear before the war are no longer clear, and the peace does not automatically redraw them. Ba Sing Se is its own geography. The city that refused to fall for 95 years, that fell not to military assault but to internal betrayal and political manipulation, holds its shape intact after the war, but holds something else too, the memory of what it took to maintain that shape. The three-ring city, outer ring and middle ring and inner ring, each with its own class of resident, each separated from the others by walls within walls, is a physical structure that encodes the same inequality that the Dai Li enforced through brainwashing. The walls that protected Ba Sing Se from the Fire Nation are the same walls that protected Ba Sing Se's upper classes from its lower ones. The peace does not automatically open those internal walls either. Geography is where the abstract becomes concrete. You can talk about conquest and colonization and cultural destruction as political and historical categories. But when you stand in the Southern Air Temple and hear nothing, when you see the tent village that was once a proper settlement, when you walk through a Fire Nation colonial town built over an Earth Kingdom cultural site, the abstract becomes undeniable. The world the war built is the world the survivors inherit. The landscape remembers even when the people in it try to forget. And this is why the ending of the 100-Year War is not quite the ending of Avatar's story, and why The Legend of Korra is not just a sequel but a natural continuation. The geographic and social and political consequences of 100 years of war are not resolved in a season. They are resolved imperfectly and incompletely across generations. Republic City, the great neutral city built on the old Fire Nation colonies, is Ba Sing Se's counterpart in the next era. A place where the war's consequences are still working themselves out in the streets, and the politics, and the class tensions, and the cultural negotiations of people who are trying to build something new out of the rubble of something that lasted a century. The Hundred-Year War ended on a day in 100 AG. The world it made lasted considerably longer. That world is still visible in every episode of Avatar, in the scar tissue of the landscape, in the things that are missing, in the small communities holding on at the edges of a world that tried to erase them, in the single airbender walking through empty temples, in the tea shop that is also a refuge, that is also a philosophy, that is also a quiet declaration that civilization can survive what is done to it if the people who carry it refuse to let it go. The war is over. The world it made is still here. And so, somehow, is the world it tried to destroy. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, genuinely, thank you. This took everything I had to put together, and I hope it gave you something in return. Subscribe if you are not already. It is the simplest possible thing you can do to keep this kind of content coming. And I will see you next time, somewhere deep in the lore. Bonus Section 3. The people history forgot unnamed lives inside a named war. Every war produces its monuments, and its named battles and its famous figures. The Siege of Ba Sing Se, the Fall of Omashu, General Iroh, Fire Lord Ozai, Phoenix King. The names accumulate into a kind of structure that makes the war legible, gives it shape, allows it to be taught and remembered and argued about. But the structure of named things sits on top of an ocean of unnamed things, and the ocean is far larger than the structure. Let me spend some time at the bottom of that ocean. The soldier on the day of the Air Nomad genocide, who was an ordinary Fire Nation man, maybe 20 years old, handed a torch and told what to do, who had never seen an air nomad in his life, and had been educated into a story about them that made what he was being asked to do feel like something other than what it was. We do not know his name. We will never know his name. The show does not show him to us because it cannot show us everyone, and because his face, his particular face, is not what matters. What matters is that he existed, and that millions of people like him existed, and that the war was not carried out by monsters with obvious evil in their eyes, but by ordinary men who had been given ordinary reasons to do extraordinary things. The waterbender captured by the Southern Raiders sometime in the 40th year of the war, who was not Hama, who did not escape, who spent the remainder of their life in a Fire Nation prison without ever finding the specific terrible innovation that Hama found, and who died there without their name entering any record that story chose to preserve. The Earth Kingdom village in a western province that was absorbed into Fire Nation administration in the war's 50th year, whose inhabitants woke up one morning to find Fire Nation soldiers in their streets and Fire Nation flags on their buildings, and an administrator who spoke a different language, explaining in that language what their lives were going to be. From now on, the old woman in that village who remembered what the village used to look like before the flags changed, who told her grandchildren stories about it, who kept the old language alive in the kitchen when the official language was required everywhere else. She is in the background of the show, in the way that everyone who lived through the war's quiet middle is in the background, visible only in what her grandchildren became. The Earth Kingdom soldier who held the line at some unnamed section of wall during some unnamed battle in the war's 60th year, not at Ba Sing Se, not somewhere recorded in the campaign histories, but at a stretch of earthen fortification in a field that is now probably a Fire Nation colony, who stood his ground because he understood that every day the line held was another day his village behind the line did not have to face what the villages in front of it had faced. He died there, probably. The line did not hold forever, but it held that day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and eventually it held long enough for someone else to find a way to end the thing that had been coming for him all his life. The children. Every generation of children born during the 100-Year War was born into it completely. They did not know a world before it. The war was not something that had happened to their world. It was the shape their world had always had. Fire Nation children grew up with the war as the organizing principle of national purpose. The reason their fathers were sometimes away and sometimes came back different, the reason there were certain things you did not say in public, the reason the schools taught what they taught. Earth Kingdom children grew up with the war as the condition of survival, the thing their parents were always calculating around, the shadow that lengthened over everything when the news from the Western Front was bad. Waterbender children in the Southern tribe grew up knowing they were a target, not in the abstract way that all children of a nation at war know danger. In the specific way, The Southern Raiders came for people like them, people who could do what they could do. Children who discovered their bending ability for the first time and felt the thrill of it, and then saw the look on their parents' faces, the complicated mixture of pride and terror that had no clean word for it, and understood without being told that what they had found was also something they would need to be careful with. Katara was one of those children. She was 8 years old when she lost her mother and discovered that her bending ability had made her family a target. She grew up carrying both of those things simultaneously, the gift and what it cost, and she became what she became partly because of how she learned to carry them. When she mastered waterbending, she did not bend like someone who had been trained from the start in a safe and supportive environment with a community of teachers. She bent like someone who had taught herself in secret and carried the weight of what the ability meant as a built-in part of how she held it. That is what the war does at the level of individual development. It shapes the people inside it into the particular shapes that survival inside it requires. Not uniformly, not identically. Each person bent by the specific pressures of their specific position inside the conflict, but none of them unmarked. None of them the people they might have been in a world where the war was not the condition. There is a conversation between Sokka and Katara early in Book 1 where they are arguing, as siblings argue. And Katara says something about their mother, and Sokka's face changes, and both of them are held for a moment by the same loss. It is a small moment, lasting only a few seconds, and the show does not underline it or score it with anything emotional. It is just there, in the middle of a disagreement about something else, the loss asserting itself the way loss does in real life, suddenly and without invitation, in the middle of ordinary moments. That is the 100-Year War at the level of its actual texture, not the Fire Lords and their plans. The loss in the middle of an ordinary argument between a brother and sister who miss their mother. There are 10,000 moments like that embedded in the show, in the background, in the spaces between the lore. Each one is the war, expressed through the particular person it fell on, the particular shape it left in the particular life it touched. The lore is the structure. These moments are the weight. Both are real. Both matter. And the reason that Avatar carries the weight it does, the reason it sits in people for decades after they first encounter it and keeps giving back something new every time they return to it, is that it never forgets the weight in pursuit of the structure. It holds both. It gives you the history and the moment, the named battle and the unnamed child, the comet that started everything and the cup of tea that means it did not end everything. The 100-Year War is the largest story Avatar tells, and it is told in the smallest possible increments, one person at a time, one loss at a time, one choice at a time, all of them adding up to a world. And that is what I wanted to give you tonight. Not just dates and campaigns and Fire Lord names, though those matter, the texture underneath them, the sense of what it actually means for a world to spend a century at war, not as a political category but as a lived condition, something that shapes every person who is born into it and leaves marks that outlast the conflict by generations. The 100-Year War is the spine of Avatar's story. Everything else the show is, the humor and the philosophy and the found family and the training arcs and the bending and the ASMR quietness of a night fire in the Earth Kingdom countryside, all of it runs alongside this spine. And the spine is heavy because it was built from real grief and real loss and real choices made by real people, even if those people were animated and the world they lived in was imagined. What imagination built here is not a simple story of good and evil. It is a story about patterns, how they start, how they sustain themselves, how they eventually break, and what the breaking costs, and who pays the cost, and whether what is built in the aftermath is worth what was lost to make space for it. I think it is. The world of Avatar, after the war, is worth the 100 years. Not because the 100 years were worth it. They were not. No amount of eventual peace makes the air nomad genocide worth it, or the Southern Raiders worth it, or the childhood taken from Sokka and Katara and a generation of Earth Kingdom children worth it. The losses do not pay for the gains. That is not how grief works, and Avatar is too honest to pretend it is. But what the world after looks like, Iroh's tea shop and Zuko's open hand, and the white lotus at the gates of Ba Sing Se, is worth trying to build, worth protecting, worth understanding all the way down to its roots, including the roots that run through the darkest parts of the century that preceded it. You have been here for all of it. That matters.